Steve Harvey has spent decades making people laugh on Family Feud, turning awkward moments into comedy gold, and creating a space where families from all walks of life could celebrate together. But on one unforgettable episode, Steve did something that shocked millions. He stopped the game completely and checked a racist contestant who tried to humiliate a black family on national television. What happened next wasn't just about one family or one moment of cruelty. It was about the cost of staying silent when hatred disguises itself as humor, and the courage it takes to choose confrontation over comfort. This is the story of the day Steve Harvey's microphone became more than entertainment. It became a weapon for justice. And what unfolded on that stage would force everyone watching to answer one devastating question. When racism happens right in front of you, what do? The Johnson family walked onto the Family Feud stage like they were stepping into a dream they'd rehearsed 1,000 times but never quite believed would come true. They were dressed in matching royal blue shirts with their family name emblazoned across the front in gold letters. The kind of coordinated outfit that said, "We planned for this. We prepared for this. We belong here." Kenneth Johnson, the father, was a high school history teacher with kind eyes and the sort of steady presence that made students feel safe asking questions. His wife Angela worked 2 jobs, one as a medical receptionist during the day and another doing data entry at night. And she had the exhausted radiance of someone who'd sacrificed sleep for years so her children could have chances she never did. Their daughter Maya was 17. College-bound if the scholarships came through, carrying herself with that careful dignity teenagers adopt when they're trying to prove they're more mature than the world gives them credit for. 10-year-old Jamal was bouncing on his toes like he'd consumed his body weight in sugar, unable to contain the pure, unfiltered excitement of being on actual television. And then there was Miss Lorraine, the grandmother, the matriarch, 73 years old, and standing like she'd been carved from something stronger than stone. Dignity wrapped in Sunday church clothes and a lifetime of refusing to bow. The audience erupted as Steve Harvey introduced them, and the Johnsons waved with the kind of joy that felt almost fragile, like they were afraid if they celebrated too hard that the moment might shatter. Kenneth shook Steve's hand with both of his, thanking him 3 times in rapid succession. Angela kept touching her hair, smoothing it down even though it was perfect. Maya smiled so wide her face had to hurt. Jamal was practically vibrating. Miss Lorraine nodded once at Steve, a gesture of respect between people who understood what it meant to stand on stages you weren't always welcome on. Steve did his usual opening routine, the warm banter that had made Family Feud feel less like a game show and more like a family reunion where everyone was invited. He joked with Kenneth about whether being a teacher prepared you for the pressure of game show questions. And Kenneth laughed and said dealing with teenagers was harder than anything Steve could throw at him. The audience loved it. Everything felt exactly like it was supposed to. Wholesome, fun, the kind of television families could watch together without anyone reaching for the remote. The opposing family, the Connors, took their positions on the other side of the stage, and they looked like they'd been designed by a casting director who'd been told to find people who screamed success. Brad Connor stood at the front, mid-40s, expensive haircut. The kind of confident posture that comes from a lifetime of doors opening before you have to knock. His wife stood beside him looking like she'd stepped out of a country club brochure. His brother had that same genetic lottery winner quality. His cousin, his nephew, they all had the polished, camera-ready appearance of people who were used to being looked at and liked what they saw. Brad shook Steve's hand, with the firm grip of someone who'd been taught that handshakes matter, that they communicate dominance, that you establish hierarchy in the first 3 seconds of contact. He smiled at the cameras like he already knew he was going to win, like this was just a formality before the inevitable celebration. Steve asked Brad what he did for a living, and Brad said he worked in real estate development, said it with the tone of someone who expected to be impressed. Steve made a joke about Brad probably trying to sell him a condo right there on stage, and the audience laughed, and Brad laughed too, the kind of laugh that said, "I'm a good sport, I can take a joke, I'm one of the fun ones." The game began with the energy that made Family Feud a cultural institution. Steve read the first question, something about the top things people forget when they leave the house. And Kenneth and Brad faced off at the buzzer. Kenneth was faster. He said keys, and the board lit up with the number one answer. The Johnson family erupted in celebration, jumping and hugging like they'd just won the lottery instead of one round of a game show. The audience cheered. Steve gave Kenneth an elaborate high five that turned into a handshake that turned into a half hug, the kind of spontaneous celebration that felt genuine. But as the Johnsons huddled to answer the remaining items on the board, Brad made his first comment. He said something about how cute it was that they'd gotten matching shirts, said it loud enough for the microphones to catch. With a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and a tone that landed somewhere between condescending and dismissive. The word cute hung in the air, with a weight it shouldn't have carried. Cute like a child's drawing, cute like something you pat on the head and don't take seriously. Angela's smile flickered for just a second. A barely perceptible hesitation before she forced it back into place. Maya glanced at her mother, reading the micro-expression with the fluency children develop when they've spent their lives translating their parents' unspoken discomfort. Kenneth's shoulders tensed slightly, a physical response he couldn't quite control. Steve redirected immediately, his professional instincts kicking in like muscle memory. He made a joke about matching shirts being good luck, said something about the Johnsons clearly having a strategy. Pulled focus back to the game with the skill of someone who'd spent 40 years learning how to navigate moments that threatened to veer off script. The audience laughed. Not everyone, but enough. The kind of laughter that fills space, that smooths over awkwardness, that lets everyone pretend nothing uncomfortable just happened. The Johnsons kept playing. Maya gave an answer that made the board light up. Jamal's turn came, and he was so nervous he could barely speak. But Miss Lorraine put her hand on his shoulder, and he managed to squeak out an answer that got them another 100 points. The family was winning, and with each point they scored, you could see them relaxing into it, starting to believe this was really happening, that they were really here, that they deserved this moment. But with every point the Johnsons scored, Brad's comments got sharper. When Jamal gave his answer and the family celebrated, Brad said something to his wife, loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability, about whether they'd practiced their handshakes and celebrations, said it with a smirk that suggested the Johnsons' joy was performative, excessive, something to be mocked rather than shared. His wife touched his arm like she was trying to stop him, a gentle warning that he ignored. Steve heard it. You could see it in the way his smile held steady, but his eyes changed, the way he paused for a fraction of a second before reading the next question. He'd spent decades in entertainment, decades navigating predominantly white spaces, decades developing the radar that every black person in America knows, the ability to detect when something is off, when the air in the room has shifted, when you need to be careful. But Steve kept the show moving. That was his job. Keep the energy up. Keep everyone comfortable. Don't let tension build. Redirect, joke, smooth over, move forward. The Johnsons won the first round decisively. Kenneth answered the final question, and the board revealed they'd captured over 200 points. The family erupted again. Jamal jumped into his father's arms. Maya hugged her grandmother. Angela had tears in her eyes from the sheer overwhelming joy of succeeding at something in front of millions of people. Steve celebrated with them. his genuine warmth on full display, telling them they'd played a great round, that they should be proud. The audience applauded enthusiastically. For a moment, everything felt right again. But as they transitioned to the next round, Brad made another comment. He said something about the Johnsons having street smarts. Said it like it was a compliment, but with an edge that made it clear it wasn't. With an implication that street smarts were different from real intelligence. That the Johnsons had won through some kind of cultural intuition rather than actual knowledge. A few people in the audience laughed. Nervous laughter, uncertain laughter, the kind of laughter that asks, "Is this okay to find funny?" But it was laughter nonetheless. Kenneth's jaw tightened. Angela's hand found Maya's and squeezed. Miss Lorraine's expression didn't change. She'd spent 73 years hearing comments like this, had developed the armor necessary to survive them. But something in her eyes went cold and distant. Steve redirected again, but this time there was an edge in his voice, a slight sharpness that suggested his patience was wearing thin. He made a joke at Brad's expense. Something about Brad needing to focus on his own family's answers instead of commentating on everyone else's. The audience laughed, louder this time, relieved to have permission to laugh at Brad instead of with him. Brad held up his hands in mock surrender, playing the good sport, but his smile had an edge now. He didn't like being corrected, didn't like being made the butt of the joke, didn't like Steve Harvey, a black man, putting him in his place on national television. The game continued. The Connors rallied, scored some points, narrowed the gap. Brad's family was actually playing well, giving good answers, working together effectively. But Brad couldn't let it just be about the game. Every few minutes, he'd make another comment about urban culture, about the Johnsons' energy being very enthusiastic, about whether they even understood some of the questions Steve was asking. His family was visibly uncomfortable now. His wife had stopped smiling. His brother was staring at the floor between questions. His cousin looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. But some people in the audience were still laughing. Not most, maybe a quarter of them, maybe less. But enough to encourage Brad. Enough to make him think he was being funny rather than cruel. Enough to make him believe he could keep going. The Johnsons were still winning, still playing well. But the joy had drained out of it. Kenneth was answering questions through gritted teeth, his responses clipped and professional. Angela looked like she was fighting tears, her smile now a mask she wore to avoid giving Brad the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten to her. Maya had stopped making eye contact with anyone. Jamal didn't understand why the fun had stopped, why his parents looked upset, why his grandmother's hand on his shoulder felt less like comfort and more like restraint. Steve was caught in an impossible position. He could feel the producers in his ear telling him to keep the show moving, to maintain the energy, to not let this derail the episode. He could see the Johnsons' discomfort, could feel their dignity being chipped away with every comment Brad made. He could hear the laughter from parts of the audience, could see other people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, could sense the studio dividing into those who thought this was funny and those who knew it was wrong. And Steve kept redirecting, kept trying to steer the show back to safe territory, kept choosing to smooth over rather than confront, because that's what hosts do. That's what professionals do. That's what people who want to keep their jobs do. Then Brad said it. They were setting up for the final round, and Brad leaned toward his microphone and made a comment about the Johnsons probably being more used to playing for chicken dinners instead of real money. Said it with a laugh like it was just a joke, just some harmless fun, just the kind of ribbing that happens on game shows. The studio went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of anticipation, but the suffocating quiet of collective shock. Half a second where every person in that audience had to process what they'd just heard, had to decide what it meant, had to choose how to respond. And then nervous laughter rippled through some of the audience, not most, but enough. Enough to break the silence. Enough to suggest maybe it was funny. Enough to give Brad permission to keep smiling like he hadn't just said something unspeakably cruel. Kenneth's jaw tightened so hard, you could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. Angela's hand found Maya's and gripped it like she was trying to anchor herself to something solid. Miss Lorraine's eyes went cold. Not angry, not hurt. Just cold. The kind of cold that comes from a lifetime of disappointments you've learned to absorb without breaking. And Steve Harvey froze mid-step. The smile was still on his face because his face hadn't gotten the message yet. But something behind his eyes shifted. Something fundamental. Something that would change everything that came next. In that half-second of silence, everyone in that studio made a choice, and those choices would define what happened next. The game resumed, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the studio. Like the air pressure had changed, and everyone could feel it in their bones, even if they couldn't name it. Brad Connor stood at his podium with the posture of someone who just discovered he had power he hadn't known he possessed. The power to make people uncomfortable and get away with it. The power to say things that lived in the shadowy margins of acceptability and have some portion of the room validate him with their laughter. He'd tested the boundaries and found them more flexible than he'd expected. And now he was emboldened in the way people become when they realize the consequences they feared aren't coming. Steve read the next question. With the professional polish of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had made him a household name. The question was something innocuous about things people do when they're nervous. And Kenneth buzzed in first again. His reflexes still sharp despite the tension radiating through his body. He answered biting your nails, and the board revealed it as the number 2 answer. The Johnsons had control again. But before they could even huddle to discuss their strategy, Brad made another comment. He said something about how the Johnsons must have plenty of experience with being nervous. Said it with a laugh that invited the audience to join him in the joke. With an implication hanging beneath the words like a weight suspended by fraying rope. The comment could have meant anything. Could have been about game show nerves, about performance anxiety, about the universal human experience of stress. But the way Brad said it, the tone he wrapped around the words, made it clear he meant something else entirely. Something about black people always having to be nervous, always having to watch their backs, always being one mistake away from disaster. A portion of the audience laughed. Not a majority, but enough to be audible, enough to register on the microphones, enough to encourage Brad to continue. It was nervous laughter, uncertain laughter, the kind of laughter people produce when they're not sure if something is funny, but they don't want to be the only one not laughing. When they're following the crowd's lead instead of their own moral compass. Kenneth's hand tightened around his podium buzzer, hard enough that his knuckles went pale. Angela closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, they were glossy with tears she refused to let fall. Maya was staring at the floor, like she could will herself to disappear through it. Jamal looked up at his father, with confusion written across his young face, trying to understand why the man who'd made jokes with them earlier was now saying things that made his parents look like they were in pain. Miss Lorraine stood perfectly still, her spine straight as rebar, her face composed in an expression that revealed nothing. She'd lived through 73 years of moments like this, different settings, different people, but the same essential cruelty wrapped in different paper. She'd learned decades ago that the only thing they couldn't take from you was your dignity. and she wore hers like armor that had been forged in fires Brad Connor couldn't begin to imagine. Steve tried to redirect with a joke about everyone being nervous on game shows, about how he'd seen people forget their own names under the lights, about how the Johnsons were actually handling the pressure better than most families he'd seen. His voice carried the forced brightness of someone trying to steer a conversation away from a cliff edge. And some of the audience responded with relief, grateful for permission to laugh at something that was actually funny instead of cruel. But Brad wasn't finished. As the Johnsons gave their answers, Angela said fidgeting, Maya said sweating, Miss Lorraine said talking too fast. Brad made commentary on each one. He said something about urban culture having its own ways of handling stress, said it like he was making an anthropological observation rather than a racist generalization. He said something about street smarts being different from the kind of intelligence that game shows usually tested. Said it with the implication that the Johnsons were succeeding through some kind of cultural luck rather than actual knowledge. His wife touched his arm again, her fingers wrapping around his wrist with pressure that clearly meant, "Stop, please stop, you're going too far." But Brad shook her off with an irritated gesture, waving away her concern like she was being oversensitive, like she didn't understand that he was just having fun, just keeping things entertaining, just saying what everyone else was thinking but was too politically correct to voice. His brother was staring at the floor between questions, his face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. His cousin had crossed his arms over his chest in a defensive posture that suggested he wanted to distance himself from what was happening, but didn't know how. Brad's nephew, who couldn't have been more than 19, looked genuinely distressed, like he was watching his uncle reveal something ugly that had always been there, but had stayed hidden until now. The audience was fracturing into visible factions. Some people were still laughing at Brad's comments. Less than before, but still present, still providing the validation that kept him going. Others had gone completely silent, sitting rigid in their seats with expressions that oscillated between shock and horror. A woman in the third row had her hand over her mouth. A man near the aisle was shaking his head slowly, continuously, like he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. A teenage girl was whispering urgently to her mother, and her mother was whispering back with the kind of frantic intensity that suggested they were debating whether to leave. But nobody moved. Nobody stood up. Nobody said anything. They sat in their seats and watched it happen because standing up would mean making a scene, would mean becoming part of the story instead of observers of it, would mean risking their own comfort to defend strangers. Steve was caught in a position that felt like being slowly crushed between two immovable forces. The producers were in his ear. He could hear their voices through his earpiece, telling him to keep the show moving, to maintain the energy, to not let this derail the episode they needed to air. They had sponsors to satisfy, a broadcast schedule to maintain, a formula that worked and couldn't be disrupted. His job was to be the host, the facilitator, the person who kept everything running smoothly no matter what happened. But Steve was also a black man who'd spent his entire life navigating spaces that weren't designed for him, who'd learned to code switch and smile through disrespect and choose his battles carefully because fighting every fight would mean never working again. He'd slept in his car for 3 years when he was starting out in comedy, had performed in rooms where he was the only black person, and had to win over audiences who decided before he opened his mouth that he probably wasn't funny. He'd built a career on being likable, non-threatening, the kind of black entertainer that white America could feel comfortable with. And he could see the Johnsons disintegrating in real time. Kenneth was answering questions like he was giving testimony in a hostile courtroom, his voice flat and careful, stripped of all the joy and personality he'd brought to the stage 20 minutes earlier. Angela was fighting tears with every breath, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested she was using every ounce of willpower to maintain composure. Maya had become a ghost of herself, present physically but absent in every other way, retreating into some internal space where Brad's words couldn't reach her. Jamal had stopped bouncing, had gone still and quiet in a way that children do when they sense danger but don't understand it. Steve tried redirecting again, tried making a joke at Brad's expense about how Brad seemed more interested in commentary than actually playing the game. A larger portion of the audience laughed this time, sensing permission to side against Brad, relieved to have a target for the discomfort they'd been absorbing. But Brad just smiled, a tight, angry smile that suggested he didn't appreciate being made the butt of the joke, didn't appreciate being corrected by Steve Harvey, didn't appreciate having his fun interrupted by someone who should have known his place. The Johnsons won the round again despite everything. Their answers solid and correct, their knowledge proving itself regardless of Brad's attempts to undermine them. They'd accumulated enough points that winning the game was becoming increasingly likely. But there was no celebration this time. Kenneth nodded once when Steve announced their score. Angela managed a weak smile that looked like it cost her something vital. Maya didn't react at all. Miss Lorraine's expression never changed. And Brad's comments got sharper, more pointed, shedding whatever thin veneer of plausible deniability they'd once carried. He said something about affirmative action extending to game shows now. Said it loud enough for everyone to hear, with a laugh that invited others to join him in the observation. He said something about diversity quotas and participation trophies, and whether the Johnsons had earned their spot on stage or checked some box a producer needed filled. Fewer people laughed this time. The laughter was becoming isolated, coming from specific sections of the audience while others sat in horrified silence. But it was still there, still present, still audible, still providing just enough encouragement for Brad to continue. Steve's jaw was tight now, the smile on his face looking more like a grimace, his eyes carrying an expression that anyone who knew how to read black men's faces in predominantly white spaces would recognize immediately. It was the look of someone doing complex calculus in real time, weighing the cost of confrontation against the cost of silence, measuring career consequences against moral imperatives, trying to figure out how to do the right thing without destroying everything he'd built. The producers were more insistent in his ear now, their voices carrying an edge of panic. They could sense the episode spiraling, could feel it becoming something other than the wholesome family entertainment Family Feud was supposed to be. They needed Steve to get control, to smooth this over, to find a way to salvage the footage into something they could actually air. But then Brad said it, the comment that shattered whatever remained of the show's facade of normalcy. He made a remark about the Johnsons probably being more comfortable in a welfare office than on a game show stage. Said it with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never had to worry about where his next meal came from. He said something about affirmative action families getting handouts they didn't deserve, about people taking things they hadn't earned, about the real Americans who worked hard being forced to compete against people who'd been given unfair advantages. The studio went silent. Not the half-second pause from before, but full, suffocating, absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels like the air has been sucked out of the room, like time has stopped, like the universe itself is holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. And this time, nobody laughed. Not a single person. Even the people who'd been laughing before had gone quiet, finally recognizing that a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, that this had gone from uncomfortable to inexcusable. Kenneth's entire body was shaking, not with fear, but with rage so profound it had become a physical force. Angela's tears were falling now, streaming down her face unchecked because she'd run out of strength to hold them back. Maya's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with humiliation and fury. Jamal started crying, overwhelmed by emotions he was too young to process. Miss Lorraine's armor finally cracked, just slightly, just enough to reveal the devastation underneath. Steve Harvey stood center stage, the microphone in his hand, the cameras rolling, the audience staring, the producers screaming in his ear to do something, say something, fix this, save the show. He'd spent 40 years learning how to handle any situation on stage, had navigated every kind of awkward moment and difficult personality and unexpected crisis that live television could throw at him. But nothing had prepared him for this. Steve Harvey stood center stage in the suffocating silence, and the microphone in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Not the physical weight of metal and electronics, but the metaphysical weight of consequence, of choice, of the moment when everything you've built can either be preserved or destroyed by what you say next. The cameras were still rolling, their red lights blinking like accusatory eyes, capturing every micro-expression, every hesitation, every second of this moment that would define not just this episode, but potentially his entire legacy. The audience stared at him with expressions ranging from horrified anticipation to desperate hope, waiting for him to do what hosts do. Smooth it over, make it okay, return them to the comfortable fiction that everything was fine. The Johnsons stood at their podium like people waiting for a verdict in a trial they never asked to be part of. Kenneth's fists were clenched so tight, his arms were trembling with the effort of not doing what every instinct in his body was screaming at him to do. Angela had given up trying to hide her tears, and they were streaming down her face in silent rivers of humiliation and rage and exhaustion from a lifetime of moments exactly like this. Maya was staring at Steve with an expression that somehow contained both desperate pleading and complete hopelessness. The look of someone who'd learned too young not to expect anyone to defend her, but couldn't quite kill the hope that maybe this time would be different. Jamal was crying openly now, his small body shaking with sobs he didn't fully understand, only knowing that something terrible had happened and nobody was stopping it. Miss Lorraine stood like a monument to dignity under siege, her face composed, but her eyes carrying the weight of 73 years of being forced to absorb cruelty and silence, because speaking up only made things worse. The producers were screaming in Steve's ear through his earpiece, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of panic and desperation. They were telling him to move on, to redirect, to make a joke, to do something, anything, to save the show, to salvage the footage, to turn this disaster into something they could edit into broadcast-appropriate entertainment. They were reminding him about the sponsors, about the network, about the contracts, about the millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs that depended on Family Feud maintaining its wholesome, family-friendly brand. They were telling him that confronting this would mean lawsuits, would mean controversy, would mean potentially destroying one of the most successful franchises in game show history, and Steve could feel the weight of all of it. His contract, his reputation, his career, everything he'd spent 4 decades building from nothing. He was the host of one of the most successful game shows in television history, a position he'd earned through talent and hard work and the kind of relentless determination that came from knowing what it felt like to have nothing. He had other shows, other projects, other income streams, but Family Feud was the crown jewel, the thing that had made him a household name, the platform that had transformed him from a successful comedian into a cultural institution. Walking away from this moment, confronting Brad directly, making a scene that the network couldn't edit around, it could cost him everything. It could mean getting fired, getting sued, getting blacklisted, becoming the difficult black host who couldn't take a joke, who made everything about race, who ruined a perfectly good show because he couldn't let things go. But Steve was also a black man who had spent his entire life navigating spaces where he had to smile through disrespect, laugh off racism, swallow his pride, and keep his head down to survive. He'd performed in comedy clubs where the audience had decided before he walked on stage that a black comedian probably wasn't going to be funny, where he'd had to work twice as hard to get half the laughs his white peers received. He'd done shows where people had walked out the moment they saw his face, where club owners had paid him less than promised, where he'd been called every racial slur in the American vocabulary and had to smile and say, "Thank you for the opportunity to perform." He was the son of Steve Harvey, a coal miner in West Virginia who'd worked in conditions that would kill him slowly, whose hands had been permanently blackened by coal dust, who'd come home every day exhausted and underpaid and disrespected, but who'd never once bowed his head to anyone. Steve Harvey had taught his son that dignity matters more than comfort, that there are moments in life where you have to choose between keeping your job and keeping your soul, and that no amount of money is worth looking in the mirror and seeing a coward staring back. Steve remembered sleeping in his car for 3 years when he was starting out in comedy, parking in different spots each night to avoid police harassment, washing up in gas station bathrooms, wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation and hoping nobody noticed. He remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to walk into rooms where people looked through him like he was made of glass. He remembered performing in front of crowds who made it clear they didn't think he belonged there, who laughed at him instead of with him, who treated his presence as an inconvenience they had to tolerate. He remembered exactly what it felt like to have no one defend you, to stand alone against cruelty and know that speaking up would only make things worse, that the system wasn't designed to protect people who looked like him, and he remembered the people who had defended him when they didn't have to. The white club owner who'd paid him extra when he found out Steve was sleeping in his car. The comedian who'd given him a spot on a show when nobody else would. The teacher who'd believed in him when the school system had written him off. He remembered how those moments had felt like miracles, like proof that the world wasn't entirely cruel, like evidence that some people understood that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of violence. Steve looked at the Johnsons again, really looked at them, and saw himself reflected in every member of that family. He saw Kenneth, a teacher who dedicated his life to educating other people's children, standing there being told he was less than, being told he didn't deserve to be on that stage, being told that his success was a handout rather than something earned. He saw Angela, working 2 jobs to give her children opportunities she'd never had, crying tears that came from a reservoir of pain so deep it could drown you if you fell in. He saw Maya, 17 years old and college-bound, learning in real time that no amount of excellence would protect her from people who'd already decided her value based on her skin color. He saw Jamal, 10 years old and having his innocence shattered, learning years too early that the world contained cruelty that wore a smile and called itself humor. He saw Miss Lorraine, who'd survived 7 decades of this and was being forced to survive it again on national television while strangers watched and did nothing. And Steve looked at the audience, at the complex ecosystem of complicity and discomfort that had allowed this to happen. He saw the people who had laughed at Brad's comments. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough to encourage Brad. Enough to make him think he was being funny rather than cruel. Enough to create the permission structure that had allowed this to escalate from microaggressions to blatant racism. Those people were looking away now, studying their laps, suddenly fascinated by their phones, unable to meet anyone's eyes because on some level they knew they'd participated in something shameful. He saw the people who had stayed silent, who had been uncomfortable but hadn't spoken up, who had witnessed every comment Brad made and had chosen to do nothing. They looked miserable now, their faces twisted with guilt and helplessness. But their misery didn't change the fact that their silence had been a choice. Every moment they'd sat there without objecting had been a vote in favor of letting it continue. Every second they'd waited for someone else to act had been a decision to prioritize their own comfort over the Johnsons' dignity. He saw the people who were visibly upset, who had recognized immediately that what was happening was wrong, who had wanted to do something but hadn't known how. They were looking at Steve with desperate hope now, pleading with their eyes for him to be the one to act, to be the one to say what they'd been thinking, but hadn't had the courage to voice. And Steve realized that this moment wasn't just about Brad or the Johnsons or even this particular episode of Family Feud. This moment was about every time racism happened in front of witnesses who chose comfort over courage. This moment was about the cost of silence, about the way good people's inaction creates the space for bad people to operate freely. This moment was about whether Steve Harvey, a man who'd built his career on being likable and non-threatening and safe, was willing to risk everything he'd built to do what his father had taught him was right. The producers were still screaming in his ear, their voices reaching a fever pitch of desperation. They were threatening now, reminding him about breach of contract clauses, about the financial consequences of derailing production, about his obligations to the network and the sponsors and the show itself. Steve reached up and pulled the earpiece out, letting it dangle from his collar. The gesture was deliberate, symbolic, a physical manifestation of the choice he was making. The producers' voices faded to a distant tinny buzz, and suddenly the studio was quieter. Or maybe it just felt quieter because Steve had stopped listening to the voices telling him to preserve the status quo at any cost. He looked down at the question cards in his hand, the script he was supposed to follow, the formula that had worked for hundreds of episodes, the safe path forward that would let everyone pretend nothing terrible had just happened. And he put the cards down on his podium, setting them aside with a finality that made several people in the audience gasp because they understood what that gesture meant. Steve reached for his microphone switch and turned it off for a moment. Another deliberate choice, another symbol. He wanted what he said next to be a conscious decision rather than a reflexive response. Wanted to choose his words carefully. Wanted to make sure that when he spoke, it was because he'd decided to speak rather than because the script required it. He looked at Brad, who was still standing at his podium with that tight, angry smile, still thinking he could charm his way out of this, still believing that his confidence and his privilege would protect him from consequences the way they always had before. He looked at the cameras, at the red lights that meant millions of people would eventually see this, that what happened next would be preserved forever, that there was no taking it back once he started. He looked at the audience one more time, at all those faces waiting to see what he would do, waiting to learn whether their hope or their cynicism would be validated. And Steve Harvey turned his microphone back on and made his decision. Not the decision that would save his career or protect the show or make the producers happy, but the decision that would let him look in the mirror tomorrow and recognize the man staring back at him. What Steve Harvey said next would force everyone in that studio and everyone watching at home to confront the cost of their silence. Steve Harvey's voice, when he finally spoke, didn't carry the rage that everyone expected, didn't have the explosive anger that would have let Brad dismiss this as an emotional overreaction, that would have allowed the audience to write this off as just another celebrity losing their temper, that would have given the network an excuse to edit it out and pretend it never happened. Instead, Steve spoke with the kind of calm, devastating clarity that makes every word land like a physical blow, the kind of measured precision that forces people to actually hear what's being said instead of just reacting to how it's being said. His voice was quiet enough that the audience had to lean forward to catch every word, controlled enough that nobody could accuse him of being unreasonable. but carrying an undercurrent of pain and fury that made it clear this wasn't a performance. This was a reckoning. He addressed Brad directly, saying his name with a flatness that stripped away any pretense of game show camaraderie, any illusion that they were just two guys having fun on television. Steve told Brad that what he'd said wasn't funny, wasn't clever, wasn't the kind of harmless ribbing that happens on game shows. He said that Brad had stood on that stage and systematically dehumanized an entire family, had taken their joy and their dignity and their moment of triumph and tried to turn it into evidence of their inferiority. He said that Brad had used humor as a weapon, had hidden cruelty behind laughter, had relied on the social contract that says hosts are supposed to keep things light to protect himself from accountability. Steve's words were surgical, precise, cutting through every defense Brad might have mounted. He anticipated the excuses before Brad could voice them. Said that claiming it was just a joke didn't make it less racist. That saying he didn't mean it that way didn't erase the impact. That insisting he had black friends or wasn't a bad person didn't change what he'd done in that moment. Steve said that racism didn't require burning crosses or white hoods. That some of the most insidious racism happened exactly like this. In comments disguised as humor, in microaggressions that individually seemed too small to confront, but collectively created an environment of hostility and degradation. Brad's face had gone from angry to pale, from defensive to something approaching fear. His mouth opened and closed several times as he tried to formulate a response, tried to find the words that would let him reclaim control of the narrative. But Steve didn't give him the space. This wasn't a conversation. This was a reckoning. Then Steve turned his attention to the audience, and the energy in the studio shifted from uncomfortable to unbearable. He talked about the laughter, about the people who had laughed at Brad's comments, who had treated cruelty as entertainment, who had made those comments acceptable by validating them with their amusement. Steve said that every laugh had been a vote, had been permission, had been encouragement for Brad to continue. He said that the people who laughed might tell themselves they were just being polite, just trying to ease tension, just going along with the crowd. But their laughter had consequences. Their laughter had told Brad he was right. Their laughter had told the Johnsons they deserved what was happening to them. Their laughter had been a choice, and choices have meaning. The people in the audience who had laughed were staring at their laps now, their faces flushed with shame, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Some of them were crying, not the dignified tears of righteous emotion, but the ugly, desperate tears of people confronting their own complicity, of people realizing they'd participated in something they'd have to carry with them forever. But Steve wasn't done with the audience. He turned his attention to the people who hadn't laughed, who had been uncomfortable but had stayed silent, who had recognized that what was happening was wrong, but hadn't spoken up. He asked them what they'd done when Brad made those comments. Had they said anything? Had they objected? Had they walked out? Or had they sat in their seats and waited for someone else to act? Had they prioritized their own comfort over the Johnsons' dignity? Had they chosen the path of least resistance because confronting racism felt too awkward, too risky, too uncomfortable? Steve said that silence was a choice, that every moment they'd sat there without objecting had been a decision to let it continue. He said that good people's silence was what allowed cruelty to flourish, that racism didn't need active participants when it had passive enablers, that the cost of their comfort was someone else's humanity. He said that they might tell themselves they didn't know what to do, that they were afraid of making things worse, that they didn't want to cause a scene. But their silence had caused harm, regardless of their intentions. The audience looked devastated. People were crying openly now, their faces twisted with guilt and shame and the horrible recognition that they'd failed a moral test they hadn't known they were taking. Some people had their faces in their hands. Others were staring at the Johnsons with expressions of anguished apology. The woman in the third row, who'd had her hand over her mouth earlier, was sobbing so hard her shoulders were shaking. Steve's voice softened slightly, but the intensity didn't diminish. He talked about his own complicity, about the times he'd redirected instead of confronting, about the times he'd smoothed things over to keep the show moving, about the times he'd chosen comfort over courage. He said that he'd felt Brad's comments escalating, had recognized the pattern, had known where it was heading, and he'd tried to handle it with jokes and redirection because that's what hosts do. That's what professionals do. That's what people who want to keep their jobs do. Steve said that he'd been calculating the entire time, weighing the cost of confrontation against the cost of silence, measuring his career against the Johnsons' dignity, trying to find a way to thread the needle where he could do the right thing without destroying everything he'd built. And he said that calculation itself was part of the problem, that treating someone's humanity as a variable in a cost-benefit analysis was its own form of violence. That every second he'd spent calculating had been another second the Johnsons had to stand there and absorb humiliation, while the person with the microphone and the platform chose to protect himself instead of them. Steve said he was done with that. Not anymore. Not today. Not ever again. He said that he'd spent 40 years learning how to navigate predominantly white spaces, how to make white audiences comfortable, how to be the kind of black entertainer that didn't make people nervous. And all of that had been necessary for survival, had been the price of admission to rooms that weren't designed for people who looked like him. But that price had gotten too high. The cost of his comfort had become someone else's degradation, and he couldn't live with that anymore. The studio was completely silent, except for the sound of people crying. Even the crew members were frozen. Cameras still rolling, but operators visibly emotional. Sound technicians with tears streaming down their faces. Production assistants standing with their hands over their mouths in shock. Then Steve turned to the Johnsons, and his voice broke for the first time. He apologized. Not just for Brad, not just for the audience, but for himself. For every moment he didn't stop it sooner. For every second he let them stand there and absorb that humiliation while he calculated whether confronting it was worth the risk. For choosing to protect the show instead of protecting them. For being complicit in their degradation even as he recognized it was happening. Kenneth was crying openly now, tears streaming down his face as he nodded at Steve with an expression that somehow contained both devastation and gratitude. Angela was sobbing, her entire body shaking with the release of tension she'd been holding since the moment Brad made his first comment. Maya had her arms wrapped around her mother, her face buried in Angela's shoulder, her own tears soaking through the fabric of their matching shirts. Jamal was clinging to his father's leg, still not fully understanding what had happened, but sensing that something important was taking place. That the adults around him were feeling things too big for his young mind to process. Miss Lorraine stood still for a long moment, her face still composed in that expression of dignified endurance that had carried her through 7 decades of moments like this. Then she walked across the stage toward Steve, her steps slow and deliberate, her spine still straight, her head still high. She reached out and took Steve's hand in both of hers, and the look that passed between them said everything that words couldn't. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for not staying silent. Thank you for remembering that our humanity matters more than your comfort. Thank you for being willing to risk everything to defend people you didn't have to defend. Steve's hand tightened around hers, and for a moment they just stood there. 2 black people who'd spent their entire lives navigating spaces that required them to be smaller, quieter, more palatable, more forgiving than anyone should have to be. Acknowledging each other across the generational divide. Recognizing the weight they'd both carried and the courage it took to finally put it down. But Steve wasn't done. Because accountability without consequences is just performance. Steve Harvey released Miss Lorraine's hand and turned back to Brad with an expression that had moved beyond anger into something colder and more final. The look of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade and had accepted all the consequences that came with it. He told Brad he was done, and the words landed with the weight of absolute authority. Not just done with this round, not just done with this particular exchange. Brad was being removed from the show. His family could stay and finish the game if they wanted to, could continue playing without him. But Brad himself was leaving. Security was already moving toward the stage, two large men in dark suits making their way through the studio with the deliberate pace of people who'd been given clear instructions. Brad's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: shock, disbelief, indignation, and finally a kind of desperate anger that comes from realizing you've miscalculated badly, and there's no way to undo it. He tried to defend himself, his voice rising with a mixture of panic and outrage. He insisted it was just jokes, just harmless fun, just the kind of banter that happens on game shows all the time. He claimed everyone was too sensitive now, that you couldn't say anything anymore without people getting offended, that he didn't mean anything by it. He appealed to the audience, to his family, to anyone who would listen, insisting that he wasn't a racist, that he had black friends, that people were overreacting to nothing. But Steve cut him off with a gesture that was somehow more powerful than shouting. He said that intent doesn't erase impact, that the harm Brad caused was real regardless of whether he meant it. He said that claiming something was just a joke is what people say when they get caught being cruel, when they want the permission to hurt people without facing consequences. He said that Brad had a choice in every moment. A choice about what words to use, what comments to make, what kind of person to be. And Brad had made his choices. Now Steve was making his. The network was in complete chaos. Producers were scrambling in the control room, their voices a cacophony of panic as they tried to figure out what to do, how to handle this, whether they could stop it. Legal was being pulled in, trying to determine if Steve had just violated a dozen contracts, whether removing a contestant mid-show opened them up to lawsuits, whether they could salvage any of this footage into something broadcastable. The sponsors were being contacted, the network executives were being woken up. The entire machinery of television production was grinding to a halt as everyone tried to process what was happening. But Steve didn't care. He looked directly at the cameras, not at the audience, not at the producers, but at the cameras themselves, at the millions of people who would eventually see this, and told them that if the network had a problem with what he'd just done, they could fire him. He said he'd spent 40 years building his career, and he'd throw it all away before he'd be complicit in racism for the sake of ratings ever again. He said that some things mattered more than contracts, more than money, more than maintaining the comfortable fiction that everything was fine, as long as nobody made a scene. Security escorted Brad from the stage, and he went reluctantly, still protesting, still insisting this was all a misunderstanding, still unable or unwilling to understand, that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His family stood at their podium, looking shell-shocked, uncertain whether to stay or leave, caught between loyalty to Brad and recognition that what he'd done was indefensible. Eventually, they chose to leave with him, filing off stage in silence while the audience watched with expressions ranging from satisfaction to discomfort. The game resumed, but it was different now, transformed from entertainment into something sacred, something meaningful. The Johnsons played with a focus and dignity that felt like an act of resistance. Like every answer they gave was a refusal to let Brad's cruelty define them or diminish them. Kenneth answered questions with his head high, his voice steady and strong. Angela had stopped crying and stood with fierce determination. Maya played with confidence that hadn't been there before, empowered by seeing someone defend her family. Jamal was still confused, but feeding off his family's energy, sensing that something important had shifted. They won decisively, accumulating points with a combination of knowledge and strategy that proved they'd earned their place on that stage. When Steve announced their final score, the audience erupted in a standing ovation that felt less like celebration of a game show victory and more like catharsis, like collective relief, like witnessing something that restored a small measure of faith in humanity. People were crying and applauding simultaneously, their faces showing the emotional exhaustion of having lived through something intense and transformative. Steve handed the Johnson family their prize money, but everyone in that studio understood that the real prize wasn't the check. The real prize was dignity defended, humanity acknowledged, courage demonstrated. Miss Lorraine looked at her grandchildren, at Maya and Jamal, at the next generation who would inherit whatever world this generation left them, and told them to remember this moment. Remember that someone stood up for us, she said. Remember that when it mattered, when it cost something, someone chose to defend us instead of protecting themselves. The episode aired unedited. The network, after hours of debate and legal consultation and executive hand-wringing, made the decision to broadcast everything exactly as it happened. The clip went viral within hours, spreading across every social media platform, generating millions of views and shares and comments. The national conversation exploded with an intensity that surprised even people who followed these issues closely. People debated racism, complicity, the cost of silence, what hosts owe their contestants, what audiences owe the people they watch for entertainment. Brad tried to apologize, releasing a statement through his lawyer that expressed regret for any offense caused, that claimed his words had been misunderstood, that insisted he wasn't the person this moment made him appear to be. But the apology was hollow, transparently self-serving, more concerned with reputation management than genuine remorse. His employer fired him within 48 hours. His social media accounts were destroyed by the avalanche of criticism. His life became defined by his worst moment, by the 15 minutes where he'd revealed something ugly and had it preserved forever. But the Johnsons became advocates, using their unexpected platform to speak about dignity, about the importance of witnesses, about what it means when someone with power chooses to use it correctly. They gave interviews, spoke at events, became voices in conversations about race and media and the responsibility of bystanders. Kenneth talked about teaching his students that silence in the face of injustice is its own form of participation. Angela talked about the exhaustion of having to be strong all the time, of having to absorb cruelty with grace. Maya talked about learning that she deserved to be defended. Miss Lorraine talked about living 73 years waiting for moments like this. And Steve Harvey's legacy was redefined, not by the jokes he told or the shows he hosted or the comedy specials or the books or any of the other accomplishments that had made him famous, but by the moment he chose courage over comfort, confrontation over complicity, and proved that silence always has a cost, and so does breaking it. As the years passed, the impact of that moment continued to ripple outward. Schools began to incorporate discussions about the responsibilities of bystanders into their curriculums, teaching children the importance of speaking up when they witness injustice. Community organizations sprang up, inspired by the Johnson story, dedicated to fostering dialogues about race and equity. Activists referenced Steve's decision as a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle against racism in media, highlighting the power that public figures hold and the choices they make. Steve found himself invited to speak at countless events, not just as a comedian or game show host, but as a man who had stood up in a moment that mattered. He shared his story, emphasizing the importance of using one's platform for good, of understanding the weight of words and the necessity of standing against cruelty. He spoke about the conversations he had with his own children, about teaching them to be brave, to recognize their power, and to always choose empathy over indifference. In the end, the story of that episode was not merely about a game show or a moment of conflict. It became a testament to the idea that every individual has the potential to affect change. It was a reminder that in the face of cruelty, silence is not an option, and that standing up for what is right is a choice we all have to make, time and time again. Years later, people would still debate whether Steve overreacted, whether he should have handled it differently, whether confronting racism so publicly was the right move. But for the Johnsons, for every black family who'd ever been humiliated and had no one defend them, for everyone who'd ever stayed silent and regretted it, there was no debate. Steve Harvey had proven that the most important moments in life aren't the ones where we keep everyone comfortable. They're the ones where we choose who we're willing to protect and who we're willing to sacrifice for the sake of peace.